The obvious immediate caveat is that everyone is different, but we have some really interesting data sets that track the same households over decades. When you track people over time in the health and retirement study, there's very strong evidence that the average retiree does not increase their spending every year by inflation. Let's say that inflation is 3% per year on average. Retiree spending doesn't go up by that full amount each year. It will go up less on average, say maybe 1 or 2% per year. Over a 20 or 30-year retirement period, that can make a massive difference in terms of how much they have to save for retirement and how much they can spend. That is a quote from the chapter of the book that I'm going to be talking with you today. We're going to continue our series on the book written by Christine Benz called How to Retire, where she gathered essentially 20 of the greatest minds in the retirement space and financial planning space and just personal finance space to write a book about how retirees can save money, can spend money, and like I talked about on last week's podcast, find an avenue through which they can enrich their lives. So the books that we're discussing or the chapters of this book that we're discussing, they're not purely for edification purposes, though I'm sure you will learn a lot about retirement planning. But don't forget, we're trying to discover how it is that we're going to live a great life, not just in retirement, but even before that. In the chapter today, she interviews a man by the name of David Blanchett. David Blanchett has been one of the top retirement researchers in the world for nearly 2 decades. And he has all the credentials. He's a fellow chartered financial analyst and certified financial planner with a doctorate in financial planning. What Christine loved most about working with David for the nearly 10 years he worked in Morningstar, though, was that he was always ready to help. David has researched all the important aspects of retirement planning and investing during his career, withdrawal rates, guaranteed income, and asset allocation during retirement, to name a few. And that's really where the conversation is going to center today, because David has some, I wouldn't say counterintuitive or, nonconformist views on spending in retirement, because he actually shares a lot of the views that Scott and I have expressed previously on the podcast when it comes to that spending in retirement, how you can allocate your capital in order to not only make sure you don't run out of money, but to provide you with some comfort when you're spending. Because as Mo discussed way back in time on a previous episode, if you are not comfortable spending your money in retirement, there's really no point in doing it. You're not really retired at that point. So David's going to get into some of his interesting insights on asset allocation, safe withdrawal rates. We're going to discuss the A word, as he calls it, annuities here. And we're going to link to some other really interesting research that's been done there. But let's just dive into the first part of their discussion. So right out of the gate, the quote that I just read you, he's talking about how one of the main concerns retirees have in retirement is, will my spending inflate at the average annualized inflation rate that we've seen historically? And his answer is a fairly prominent no. He's saying most retirees do not spend 3% more per year every single year while they are retired. In fact, David Blanchett was made maybe not most famous, but he was made famous for the retirement income smile. And if you can imagine, if you drew a smiley face on a piece of paper, you would see that it would go from high spending years, so this would be on the left-hand side of the smiley face. Spending would decline in nominal terms and perhaps real terms over time, because it's certainly not rising. It might rise a little bit, but it's not rising as fast as inflation, so it's declining in real terms. And then some people experience a big jump in their spending near the end of life, and that is largely because they have some catastrophic healthcare need right at the end of their life that costs a lot of money. But David's actually going to demystify how that right-hand tail of the smile came to be. And it's not, I don't think it's as dire as a lot of people like to think it is. So David goes on to say in this interview, if you look at how average spending evolves over time for young retirees, especially those entering their 70s, it tends to decline in today's dollars. And that tracks with some of the things that Scott and I have talked about previously, where the adage in the industry is you've got your go-go years, your slow-go years, and then your no-go years. And your go-go years are typically from day one of retirement, which for many people who we work with could be as early as 60 or even slightly before. But for most people, I'd say on average is probably closer to 65. So your go-go years are probably 65 to 75. So that 10-year period, if you can imagine, is that left-hand side of the smiley face where your spending is probably the highest it's going to be in retirement. But once you hit 75, as David's alluding to here, or 70 to 75, your income is actually going to start to decline in real terms. So again, that doesn't necessarily mean nominally. That doesn't mean you're actually spending fewer of your dollars every year. It just means you're not increasing your annual spend by the rate of inflation. So he goes on. That doesn't mean it's decreasing in nominal terms. It's just not keeping up with inflation. What happens at around age 90 to 95, though, is that it can start kicking back up. There's one very important nuance, however. For most retirees, spending just keeps going down in today's dollars for their entire lives. Okay, so that's what he's saying is, yes, there is a select few of individuals who, between the ages of, say, 90 and 100, they have some very catastrophic healthcare need, and that drives that very last part of the smiley face back up. But what David Blanchett is pointing out is that's a small, it's a small subset of that population who spends a disproportionate sum, which brings that average spend up for everybody, but it doesn't really inform what the typical retiree is going to experience in those last 5 years of life. A good way to imagine this is if you have a stadium full of people, you could take their average annual income, and then if you did that same stadium, or their net worth, if you did that same stadium full of people, but Bill Gates is present, you're going to get a wildly different average, but you're not going to get a different typical net worth. So there's a difference between average, which is what David's talking about here, and typical, and that's the really important nuance that he's talking about. And so he says, but when you get older, you have a lot of idiosyncratic health risks. These are one-off health risks. And there might be a few retirees with spectacular healthcare costs, and their spending dramatically increases. And that causes average spending, which is just the total spending over this, piece of the population, to kick back up. Again, he's not saying that that's typical. He's just saying that you might get higher spending on average in your late 90s if you are one of those few people with spectacular healthcare costs. And so they go on to talk about, Christine says, I want to connect this back to people who are trying to figure out how much they can safely spend in retirement. That's a big question that people have. And so let's stick with those early retirees who tend to be high spenders. First, can you outline some of the reasons why those tend to be the higher spending years of retirement? And so David says, and this isn't going to come as a shock to anybody, if people have been working, they've been delaying gratification for a lot of different reasons. I think principally among those reasons is they just don't have the time to commit to the things that they want to do because they're, employed full time. And then he says, when they're retired, they can go out and they can consume. The key is that the younger and the healthier you are when you retire, the more you want to try to actively do these things, because you might not always be able to when you get older. And this is something that we leaned into quite heavily, I believe, on the last installment of this very book club that we're doing. We talked about how your enjoyment in retirement is essentially going to grow or shrink in direct proportion to how healthy your physical body is. Because most of the things that you're going to want to accomplish, particularly in those go-go years, are going to require that you can move your body without pain or without discomfort or without, the cumbersome need for a walker or a cane or a wheelchair. And that's not to say that if you are disabled or need those things to get around, that your retirement is totally not worthwhile. That's not what he's saying here. But he's saying you want to construct a retirement that's really going to take advantage of when your body is going to be at its healthiest. And your body is very likely to be at its healthiest in those early years. So spending the most money doing those things that you want to do in those early years makes a lot of sense. So thinking about decline in future spending can be good for people, because you can create the expectation that if you're retiring a little early, you want to be sure to go out and do the things while you can. But let's also set the expectation that as you move through retirement, you may have to spend a little bit less. Now, I provided a little bit of pushback here, and I think that most people probably don't view their retirement as objectively as this, by thinking, all right, I'm going to spend a lot of money in my go-go years, but I'm going to actively and purposefully slow my spending down in my, say, slow-go years and my no-go years. I think their preferences change organically as a consequence of their age. So this isn't something where you're feeling like you have to make a sacrifice, like there's dessert offered and you say no, very difficult for me to do, but rather your tastes are going to change such that even if it were offered, it's really no trouble for you to decline it. And I think that's kind of how David's getting at here, where yes, spending is going to decline over time, but it's going to happen in a really organic fashion, and you're not going to have to take austerity measures with your budget and forego some of your creature comforts in your later age, because it's very likely that those comforts are going to be quite affordable, and you're just really not going to be doing the high dollar value things that you were previously doing. So, now, one of the more interesting elements that they cover in this book are annuities. And so Christine asks David, can you touch on annuities as a component of this? And this is their income stream in retirement. especially a very basic sort of product that provides someone with a stream of income that will last their whole life. You talked about Social Security and the value of enlarging Social Security benefits so that you're alleviating spending demands in your portfolio. But can you talk about how an annuity might fit in here? And so if you think about one of the lifetime income streams that virtually everybody's going to have access to in retirement, it's going to be Social Security. Social Security functions much like an annuity. You've got a stream of income that's guaranteed for the rest of your life. And as most of us in this room know, and as sure the listener probably knows, the spousal benefit that you get once the primary income earner passes away, that can mean or portend a fairly dramatic decline in benefits being consumed by the household. And that's something David said that you should be aware of. But in order to supplement that guaranteed stream of income, they want to get into annuities. So David says the A word is perhaps the most ambiguous word in the dictionary. But to me, it's pretty unequivocal. If you want more guaranteed income, you want to first exhaust your options with respect to Social Security. In other words, delay claiming as long as you can. And that's not necessarily what we would recommend, but that's what he's saying by maximizing your benefit. After that, it might be worth considering annuities, given the potential economic benefits, which is something I focused on for most of my career. Let's set the economic benefits aside here for a second. He goes on to say, but I think the behavioral benefits of buying an annuity that provide a lifetime income can exceed the economic benefits. It can be difficult spending money from a portfolio when you don't know how long it will last or what your returns might be. Managing spending given an uncertain lifespan and uncertain returns is exhausting. The annuity gives someone the ability to say, no matter how long I live, I'm going to have some money coming in. That can radically simplify retirement. Now, I think in our practice, we try to be as agnostic about the benefits of annuities from an economic perspective as we possibly can be. And I think when he calls them the A word, that's really referencing the fact that historically and even now, you can get paid a fairly hefty commission by issuing an annuity because these are highly profitable products, generally speaking, for the insurance companies who provide them to you. But I think what David's trying to get at here is if we just set those incentives aside and we look at the way that retirees or households with annuities behave against those who do not have annuities behave and how they feel about their spending, that's where the big benefit of the annuity is revealed. And so one of the very interesting elements of research that was done by Stephen Levitt and Stephen Dubner of Freakonomics fame was they looked at households who had annuities and they controlled their longevity independent of other factors. So one of the things that they point out is it would be easy to suggest that households that have annuities live longer because the only reason they bought the annuity was because they anticipated living longer. But this is what they say. So they say, and I'll clarify this in a second, but what about those of us who aren't exceptional at science or sport? As it turns out, getting a Nobel Prize or being inducted into the Hall of Fame, those people tend to live longer. It says, well, you could purchase an annuity, a contract that pays a set amount of income each year, but only as long as you stay alive. People who buy annuities, it turns out, live longer than people who don't, and not because the people who buy annuities are healthier. The evidence suggests that an annuity's steady payout provides a little extra incentive to keep chugging along. Now, this might be my own bias, but this strikes me as such a guy thing. Like, could you imagine a more guy thing than being like, you wake up on your 90th birthday and you get your annuity check for the year and you think, still alive, keep paying me, And so it's like, there might be this other thing where we can set aside the illiquidity of an annuity or the vagaries of the annuity or the lack of transparency or the commissions paid to the salesman. And you can think, if I can live longer just by buying this product, by allocating a piece of my capital to a lifetime income stream, I would suggest that alone would be reason enough to talk with your financial advisor about whether or not adding an annuity to your portfolio is right for you. I'm not here to sell you one. I'm just here to as agnostically as possible, convey the data about the underlying benefits of annuities that I can and that Mr. Blanchett has pulled out of here. The other thing that I thought was really curious about this was there's some data published by JP Morgan with regards to spending in retirement, and they examine spending, again, households that own annuities, households that do not, and they ask people how they feel about that spending. And I guess it's not really curious given what I know. Households that have annuities spend more and they feel better about that spending. And it's not really any wonder because they've got this portion of their income that's guaranteed for life. Of course, that would certainly give you license to spend some of your other money on things that you might otherwise not have because you thought, I might run out. I want to make sure that I can cover my spending. So a typical strategy employed by some practices, you cover what are called the HUG expenses. So this is going to be housing, it's going to be utilities, and it's going to be groceries. So your housing could be your mortgage payment and your rent. It could be your property taxes and your ongoing maintenance costs. Those are basically your fixed costs to keep the lights on. Utilities, gas, internet, electricity, water, phone service. Those are things that people would probably not want to live without, and in some parts of the world and the country couldn't live without. And then finally, your groceries. So this is just food to feed you, your family. I get the sense that if you have between Social Security and an annuity enough money to cover those core expenses, you're going to feel much better about the remaining capital, and you're probably going to apply it to, things that are a little bit more that you want to do, or things that are a little bit more aspirational. You might be able to be a little bit more generous with that money because you know you're going to be taken care of and well taken care of for life. Again, kind of an annuity tangent there, but just something to consider. The last bit of work they really get into after covering some of the ins and outs of various annuities that you can buy is setting what's called a safe withdrawal rate, or setting a withdrawal rate in retirement. So Christine says, in addition to your work on how retirees spend, you've done a lot of research on retirement withdrawal rates. Can you share guidance about how people should think about a safe withdrawal rate as they embark upon retirement, bearing in mind their own spending patterns? So for the uninitiated, a withdrawal rate would just be the proportion of your assets that you could safely withdraw from your portfolio on an ongoing basis. So the typical rule would be 4%. If you have $1 million portfolio, you can withdraw $40,000. And that historically has given you the best probability of not running out of money over a typical retirement window. But David says it's useful for us in an industry to have a very simple heuristic like the 4% guideline. That's not necessarily a terrible starting point, but it really is an adaptive process. You need to think about your situation, your longevity, how you want to invest, and then figure out what makes sense for you. A lot of the key assumptions and models that we use today are flawed. There's this idea that individuals don't adjust their spending over time based on market returns, but that's not what we see. People definitely cut back if returns are lower than expected. If you incorporate changes to your spending in the future, it can radically affect what you would take out today. It almost unequivocally increases the safe initial withdrawal rate. If you look at actual retiree households, a starting withdrawal rate percentage of 5 or 6% is probably reasonable. Now, that is, again, that's not a license to go out and say, well, I read this, book and David Blanchett was saying that I could safely withdraw 6% of my portfolio per year. That's not what he's saying here. What he's saying is when you construct a financial planning model, even those that are the gold standard of financial planning models today, they have to fit essentially 4 variables or fix 4 variables in place so that the output of their model, so this would be forecasts of their model, are not so prodigious as to be useless. And so the typical 4 legs of this equation that they're going to have to fix in place to give you really workable data are going to be what you have. So what you have at your disposal. This will include Social Security. This will include an annuity if you have one. All of your investable assets. Some people will include the primary residence as an asset that might be turned to income. However liberal or conservative you want to get, that's going to be leg 1, what you have. The other leg is going to be, what do you need? So how much of that portfolio do you need to withdraw on an annual basis in order to live the life that you want to live pre-retirement or post? The third is going to be, how long do you need it? Are you retiring in your late 70s or maybe early 80s? Obviously, your safe withdrawal rate is going to be very different than a person who might need this money to last them 35 years. So what you have, what you need, how long you need it. And the final piece of this puzzle is what we think we can get on your invested assets and how much risk we have to take to get it. And that would be measured by variance or standard deviation. Those 4 things have to remain fixed in place so that we can get a good sense of what the future might look like without having to change these assumptions every year, thus squaring the number of output we would get. So if you do a Monte Carlo, you get 1,000 iterations of what the future might look like. If you change a variable, you get 1,000,000. And if you change another one, you get some number that I can't even do in my head right now. So, but what David is saying is that's not reality. Your financial plan, your Monte Carlo simulation, that stuff does not reflect how people in retirement who have their own money at risk actually behave in response to various events in the market. So his point is saying, if in a good year, so we had 2 great years, 2023 and 2024, S&P 500 did something north of 20% in both of those years. It's very likely that people are going to be out there during those years spending a little bit more than they would have during the financial crisis. David is saying it is entirely unreasonable to assume that a person is going to not modify their behavior whatsoever if the S&P 500 declined 38% and they saw their assets decline by maybe some portion of that, 20 or 25%, because they probably had some safe stuff set aside. He thinks that's entirely unreasonable. So given that we are human beings capable of adapting our behavior to our environment, he's saying the 4% rule is a very blunt tool. It's like if you are an automaton who no matter what you're going to spend every single year the same amount, 4% is probably a good starting point. But if you're not an automaton, and I would venture if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably not, then you can probably work with your advisor to set up what's often called an adaptive distribution from your portfolio, where the distribution really relies on, subject to some minimal floor that you're going to need for your ongoing expenses, how your assets have actually performed. And David thinks, and I think, that that's a far more realistic view of how people actually spend their money in retirement. And I think that's borne out in a lot of data. All right, so he goes on. Christine says, you just touched on the value of being willing to adjust spending based on portfolio performance. How does life expectancy fit in? David says, and we talked about this in the Die with Zero podcast, get a good estimate of your life expectancy. And I actually have a countdown to my 100th birthday in my office, which a lot of people think is macabre. But I think, again, it reminds me, hey, this is probably how long you're going to be here. So you might as well plan around your own mortality. Why not? And it's repeated here. Life expectancy from any of the free online tools. Dividing your current portfolio balance by your life expectancy is a decent gut check on what you could spend from a portfolio in a year, assuming that you go back and recalculate every year. The key is to give people guidance on what is safe, though the actual answer is a lot more complicated. And he raised a couple of great points. Typical retirement planning software is going to plan for retirement that is 25 or 30 years long. But if you have more money 10 years into your retirement than you did when you started, obviously your withdrawal rate should change to reflect that, because you can clearly spend a little bit more money now that you're 10 years in, because you have far fewer years of cash flows that you're going to have to produce from your portfolio. So that's certainly a mathematical license to spend a little bit more. Christine goes on. You've looked at a lot of issues regarding underspending, that wealthier retirees especially underspend relative to what they could spend. And David says, I do worry about underconsumption. Individuals aren't good at spending their savings. They're ants, not grasshoppers. When you work for 30 or 40 years, you get great at saving, not great at spending. And it can be difficult to flip the switch to start accessing those savings. And this is the dichotomy. This is the issue that Scott and I have touched on previous podcasts, where those people, when you're talking about individuals who are working with a financial advisor, you're talking about individuals who are very seriously, tracking their spending, tracking their expenses. Those kinds of individuals are ants. These are the people who have not hoarded, but who have gathered their assets very deliberately, waiting for winter to come. But they also tend to be the ones who are most or least likely to spend on themselves or spend in a way that would actually exhaust their portfolio over time. And I'm going to provide a little bit of pushback here, because I think sometimes we can take a rather, blinkered view of this, and we can immediately conclude that if there's a large estate left at the end of a retirement period, that person just, every dollar left in the estate was a sacrifice that they didn't need to make. I don't think that that's right. I think that a lot of times in retirement is a lot like a silent auction. The only way to win is to maybe overpay. And overpaying in retirement really looks like slightly under-consuming what you theoretically could have if you really wanted to dwindle your portfolio down to zero. But most people would be so paralyzed by the fear of running out of money in those last few years that they wouldn't be enjoying it. So leaving an estate of a couple $1 million, that doesn't immediately indicate to me that this was a failure. In fact, if you had the room to leave an estate of $2 million, it's likely you felt a lot better about your spending over time. Now, this can be taken to a pathological degree. You might have a person who truly feels like they are penny pinching, living a needless life of asceticism in retirement in an effort to what? We're not exactly clear, because as we'll point out to some people, you are on track to deliver the lifestyle you could have lived to your children. And if that's your goal, phenomenal. But we just want to make sure you're making these decisions regarding your personal consumption in the appropriate context. And I think Blanchett here is talking about when you get to a certain level of wealth and your ongoing income needs don't scale with the returns that you get on your portfolio or just the pure amount of the assets that you have, there's this big delta in absolute dollar terms that they don't know really what to do with. And so most people just reinvest it rather than spend it. I don't necessarily have any issues with that if you're leading the life that you want to lead. But if you come to an advisor and you ask, are we underspending? If you're a wealthy individual who's been disciplined for a 30 or 40-year career, there's a very high probability that you are mathematically underspending. But I think it's important to examine how it makes you feel when you do spend a little bit more and when you see that value of your portfolio actually starting to decline or amortize over time. So they conclude with a discussion on ways that you can kind of manipulate your estate into not being so large at the end. And so Christine says, it seems like a lot of people have this tacit assumption that they want to leave a big chunk of money to their kids. And what she's meaning is at their death. Kids may say they don't care. So should they have that conversation with their kids to find out? And I think, and David says, it's giving with the warm hand instead of the cold hand, as the saying goes. And to kind of demystify that for a second, and this is returning actually to the podcast we did on Die with Zero, Bill Perkins says, if you want to leave your children money, it is probably much more meaningful both to them and to you to do so while you are alive. And in the podcast we did on happy money, we talked about the fifth way that seemed to make people happy in ways that they spent their money was giving it away. And so if you wait till you pass away to give your children money, you rob yourself of the benefit of seeing how much that impacts their lives while you're alive, so you don't get that experience. And the second thing is, there are periods of a time where people are going to be somewhat cash flow constrained. So this typically will intersect a family when they are young or just starting out in their careers, perhaps just got married, and are going to have children. Those three things at once mean that income and expenses get pretty tight. And so it would be far more beneficial for a person in that scenario to have a financial backstop rather than to get that financial backstop, even if it is some multiple of what they could get today, 30 years in the future, when they're maybe 60 or 65 and nearing their own retirement. And that's echoed here by David. He's saying, if you can give with a warm hand, and what he's indicating there is that you're still alive, rather than a cold hand, which is the kind of giving that you do through the estate once you've passed, it's going to make you happier, it's going to make your heirs happier, and that money is probably going to go a lot farther for your heirs than it would if you were to delay. So then he says, to me, there's a balance, and I worry that too many of the assumptions and models that we use right now tilt that balance toward underspending. As an industry, we collectively have to provide people with better tools so they can get an idea of what the trade-offs are with some of these decisions. And he's absolutely right. In the financial planning software that we use, it makes a lot of punitive assumptions. It's saying your assets are going to be taxed more harshly than they really are. Your income's going to inflate more than it really will. You're going to live longer than you probably will. And expenses at the end of your life are going to be much higher than they probably will. But the reason that they make those assumptions is because we don't want to overpromise on a retirement and then underdeliver. So they are much more predisposed to say things don't look as rosy as they could, but we're better off making that assumption than the opposite. Because I think most people would rather die with an estate of $5 million than run out of money when they're 75 years old. I'm certainly of that opinion. So again, this is an obvious, plug for our own services, but to get some of these complex planning topics right, to not make, irrevocable mistakes in your retirement, to make sure that you're spending the money that you can spend and doing so prudentially, I think working with an advisor makes a lot of sense. I think getting expert opinions like we're going to continue to do in these books or in the chapters of this book to come makes a whole lot of sense. But that wraps the second iteration of How to Retire with Christine Benz and David Blanchett.
This broadcast contains the current opinions of the hosts and are subject to change. The broadcast is provided for informational purposes only and should not be considered investment advice or recommendations. Investors should obtain professional advice before making investment decisions. This is not a complete analysis of every material fact regarding any company, industry, or security. The information has been obtained from sources we consider to be reliable but cannot guarantee their accuracy. Robert W. Baird & Co. Incorporated is not a legal or tax services provider, and you are strongly encouraged to seek the advice of the appropriate professional advisors before taking any action. For more information about any companies discussed, please contact Baird. Past performance is not indicative of future results, and diversification does not ensure a profit or protect against loss. All investments carry some level of risk, including loss of principal. An investment cannot be made directly in an index. Investors should consider the investment objectives, risks, charges, and expenses of a fund carefully before investing. This and other information is found in the prospectus and summary prospectus. For a prospectus, please contact your financial professional and read it carefully before investing. Annuities carry unique risks, including market risk, investment risk, and claims-paying abilities of the insurer. There may also be instances where a contract will pay out less than the premiums paid or expire within the lifetime of the insured. There may be penalties for early withdrawal, and they are not insured by the FDIC because they are insurance, not an investment. Investors should consider carefully information contained in the prospectus or, if available, the summary prospectus, including investment objectives, risks, charges, and expenses. You can request a prospectus by reaching out to your financial advisor. Please read the prospectus carefully before investing. Investment returns will fluctuate and are subject to market volatility, so that an investor's shares, when redeemed or sold, may be worth more or less than their original cost. Unlike mutual funds, shares of ETFs are not individually redeemable directly with the ETF. Shares of ETFs are bought and sold at market price, which may be higher or lower than the net asset value. This broadcast may not be reproduced without express permission of Robert W. Baird & Co., Incorporated.